Greetings, booktubers, and welcome back to Grammaticus Books. Today we're going to be talking about the book that took me 10 years to read, and that's this book right here. And when I say it took me 10 years to read, I'm not saying that I bought the book, put it up on my bookshelf, forgot about it, and a decade later came back to it and said, oh yeah, there's that book, and pulled it down and read it. No, this book literally took me 10 years to read. I would take it down, I would read a chapter or two, my eyes would roll up inside of my head, and I'll explain that in a bit. And I would put it back up on the shelf. 4 or 5 months would go by. I would look at it. I would take it back down. I would start reading another chapter or two where I'd left off. My eyes would roll back up in my head, and I would put it back up on the shelf. And that went on for almost 10 years. But what is the book? The book that we're talking about here, it's hard to see. The front has been worn off to the point where you can't read it anymore. You can see the where it was raised up, the symbol on it and the lettering. But on the side, you can see a little better. It's The 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence, a.k.a. Lawrence of Arabia. And this is his memoir of the Arab Revolt of 1916 to 1918, in which he was instrumental in instigating it and carrying it out. And it's a fantastic book. It's an absolutely epic book. It's just a wonderful work of literature. It was praised by Winston Churchill, H.G. Wells, Bernard Shaw, all have praised it as one of the greatest works in English language literature. And that might be a little bit over the top, but it's not far off from the truth. This is a fantastic work of English literature that belongs as one of the pillars, no pun intended, of the English language. So why then did it take me 10 years to read it? Well, the answer to that is because T.E. Lawrence is a very strange guy. He was a very odd man. He grew up in England. He was educated at Oxford. He was a loner, an outsider, a romantic. He really was a bit of a misfit, and he would practice extreme acts of self-deprivation, where he would go without sleep on purpose for long periods of time. He would go without food for long periods of time in order to test his limit of his willpower. He once biked 2,000 miles across France when he was studying archaeology at Oxford in order to sketch the cathedrals that were there. He also walked 1,000 miles solo across Syria in the early 1900s as part of his archaeological exploits when he was sketching ruins out there. He was attacked by bandits while he did this. He thought he was going to be killed. He was left for dead out in the middle of the desert, and got up and staggered away and made it to a town where he was able to get a little bit of help, and then continued on to his journey. And he was a very odd guy. And even though this is a memoir of his exploits with the army during 1916, 1918, it's also a little autobiographical. And a large portion of this book, almost half of it, deals with his life prior to the army. And when I started reading this was decades ago, probably about 20 years ago is when I started reading it, if not farther back. And I didn't have as much patience back then for sort of odd tangents, which is shame on me, because it's important to the book, but I didn't have that much patience for it. And when he would go off in sort of these weird bents, my eyes would roll up on my head, and I would put the book back up on the shelf and walk away from it. And then I knew that it had such great praise for it. I would always come back to it, take it down, and read a little further. And this went on for almost 10 years until I actually got to the memoir part of the Arab Revolt. And then it just took off like a rocket. The writing is unbelievable. It's epic and poetic all at the same time. It's one of the most beautifully written books. And it's one of the most historically significant first-person accounts of an exploit that's almost hard to believe until you read it. And at that point, I just devoured the book, and it is just one of my favorite books. This particular book right here is the Doubleday 1935 edition. This book was first published in 1922. Here's the copyright page, which describes it as the privately printed 1926, first published for general circulation 1935, and this is copyright 1926 and 1935. There was actually a private production of this also in 1922, and those all had very limited print runs. And then you have the 1935 edition here. And you think this might be an expensive book. It's not. This is not an expensive book. I don't know what I paid for it 20 years ago whenever I bought it in a used bookstore, but it wasn't much at all. And you can get this exact same copy online on AbeBooks or eBay for, depending on the seller, anywhere between 20 to 50 bucks. So it's not that expensive a book. But it's a fantastic story. If you're not familiar with the Arab Revolt, it's World War One, and the British army is engaged not only against the Germans in Western Europe, but they're also fighting the Ottoman Turks in and around the Mediterranean and the Bosporus. And they're having a hard time. And so they needed diversion in order to weaken the Ottoman Empire. And they come up with the idea, if they can instigate a revolt against the Ottoman Turks in Arabia, that will work as this diversion. And they hit upon T.E. Lawrence as the perfect guy because he was a study of history. He had traveled through the Syrian area and he spoke Arabic. And frankly, I think he was kind of an oddball who was hard to supervise. And this was a way to get him out of their hair. So they send him into the desert in order to try to gather the tribes together, to get them to agree to unite in order to fight off the Ottoman Turks who have occupied Arabia at this time. So you've got this guy who's coming from this sea power, this nation, this realm that is based in sea power. He's sent out into the desert, this young man, he's in his early 20s or mid 20s. He's sent out by himself into the desert to find and meet with these desert people, these fierce but technologically primitive desert people, to gather them together and convince them to attack their technologically superior but oppressive masters, to throw off their yoke and drive them out of their desert, which sounds quite remarkably like another book of mine. This one right here, Dune, and the parallels between Dune and the 7 Pillars of Wisdom are quite remarkable. It's not one-to-one. We're not talking direct apples to apples, but we're pretty close. You can make a case that T.E. Lawrence might have been the blueprint for Herbert when he was writing up Paul Atreides. It's that close, and it's a ton of fun. This book is just, the historical significance of it. It is tremendous, and it just doesn't get enough attention today for a variety of reasons, and we'll go into that in a bit. But this book is beautifully written. I mean, it is just a poetic lyric epic that's been written by T.E. Lawrence of his accounts in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, working with Ali and Faisal, the sons of the Sharif of Mecca, and he was the perfect person to organize this revolt. As an outsider and a loner who was used to working alone, who was used to the deserts, who spoke Arabic, he was the perfect person to come in and try to get the Arabs to overlook their tribal differences, their political differences, and convince them, along with a little bit of persuasion from the British government and assistance from the British government, to come together and then attack the Ottoman Empire and the Turks. And he does. He organizes it. He guides them. He's if not the person who guided the entire enterprise, certainly without him there, it's unlikely that it ever would have come about in the manner that it did. And he was the person who was directing them and pushing them and bumping them in the right direction in order to make it successful. And it was successful. And this book gets a lot of praise, and it's well-deserved. Just his ability to describe the natural wonders of Arabia is magnificent. Again, it's poetic in its ability to do so. His ability to write passages is as good as anybody in the English language. It's just tremendous. You have to read it. It's poetic. It's historically an epic tale. It's historically significant. His descriptions of battle are cinematic in the way that he can describe the action that he's actually there in. It's a firsthand account of those battles and the whole organization of that campaign. And it's just remarkable from that level of a historic tale that you just are not going to get anywhere else in modern history, that one person could be involved in that much of this whole campaign. So he's the perfect person to write it. It's also a firsthand account of Bedouin life in the early 1900s and of their bravery and their fallacies. He's not shy about depicting the horrors of war. He will look at the horrors of war with an absolutely unflinching eye. And he's not shy about looking at his own failings too, and exposing a ton of his personal life, maybe more than he should have exposed. T.E. Lawrence was gay. He was gay at a time in Britain where it still wasn't acceptable, and he was open about it because he was extremely brave. And it doesn't come as a surprise after you read this book that he would be brave enough to put that into his novel back in 1922 when he originally wrote it, and then published in 1926 and 35 and the subsequent publishings. He was a remarkable man. But what are the critiques of it? So the critiques of this book are not of the writing, because the writing is just beautiful. You have to read it to fully appreciate it. And I'll read one passage out of here for you guys. The critiques are mostly historical. And what the critiques are is that it's historically inaccurate, that it over-exaggerates his role with the Arabs and instigating and guiding the revolt. And that might be partially true. A lot of these critiques, unsurprisingly, come from the Saudi Arabians themselves and from other sectors and segments. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. He certainly wasn't the grand general orchestrating everything, but again, without him, I doubt that the Arab revolt would have coalesced in the manner that it did and been as successful as it was. And he was also instrumental in a lot of the battles that took place. He fought in them. He was there as an engineer who was a demolitionist, and he was also helping to direct the campaign with a lot of guidance coming from the British intelligence out of Egypt as well. But it is a fantastic book. T. Lawrence himself, when he died, they put a bust of him in St. Paul's Cathedral. He was thought that highly of. He's became here's a picture of his bust that's sitting in St. Paul's Cathedral. And I'm going to read you one passage out of here so you guys can get a flavor of the writing. And this book is almost 700 pages long. It is, a word that I would use to describe this book is daunting. It's a daunting book to read, particularly the first half of it. But once you get through the first half, and it just takes off, and it is just a pleasure to read. So the passage I'm going to read to you here now is: the Arab revolt has been mostly successful. They've broken the back of the Turkish army, and the Turkish army is in full retreat. They're in a panic. They're completely disorganized. They're heading north, trying to make it to Damascus. And along with the panicked army, it's in the middle of the night as the Arabs are riding them down without mercy, because the Turks were absolutely slaughtering villagers as they were going through the villages. They were chopping the heads off of 5-year-old girls and just committing acts of rapine and murder of entire villages. So there's no mercy. And it's nighttime, and they're pursuing the Arabs. And for the first time, Lawrence comes across Germans. There were pockets of Germans. And this is him describing this flight as they're pursuing them and enacting this slaughter on the Arabs. The enemy had tried to halt and camp at sunset, but Khalid had shaken them again into movement. Some marched, some stayed. Many dropped asleep in their tracks with fatigue. They had all lost order and coherence, and were drifting through the blast in lorn packets, ready to shoot and run at every contact with us or with each other. And the Arabs were as scattered and nearly as uncertain. Exceptions were the German detachments. And here, for the first time, I grew proud of the enemy who had killed my brothers. They were 2,000 miles from home, without hope and without guides, in conditions mad enough to break the bravest nerves. Yet their sections held together, in firm rank, shearing through the rack of Turk and Arab like armored ships, high-faced and silent. When attacked, they halted, took position, fired to order. There was no haste, no crying, no hesitation. They were glorious. And that's just a sample of the writing in here. And that was a passage that even decades later, after I read this book, that just really stuck with me. And also throughout the book are sketches of the people who are in it, the historical figures. These were done by various artists, and it's filled through the book with various sketches of the people that he was dealing with, the different Arabs and the British generals and officers. And it's just a tremendous book. You can get this book off of Abe Books or from eBay, like I said, relatively cheap, or you could get a modern, more up-to-date printing of it, better condition printing for probably around $50. Or you can get it on Project Gutenberg. It's listed out on Project Gutenberg, and you can read it there online for free. I'll put a link to Project Gutenberg down in the description. But I love this book. It doesn't get enough love because it is just a pillar of the English language and just an epic book in history that deserves to be read more. It's absolutely, I keep using this word, but it's apt. It applies to it. It's epic in scope. It's poetic. It's sweeping. It's beautifully written, and it's also historically important. And for that reason, it's one of my favorite books in my library, even though it took me 10 years to read it. But man, am I glad that I did stick it out and eventually finish this daunting book. But that's it. I'd love to hear your comments. If any of you out there have read it, what you thought of The Seven Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. Put it down in the comments section. I do read all the comments. And other than that, take care, be safe, and I will catch you guys in the future.